So what I want to do today is to try and talk about what the difference is between some of the different choices that curators have to make when representing identities, and particularly when coming up against the unrepresentable and coming up against controversy in terms of the reception of the work. So hopefully we can map out what are some of the challenges for an artist in producing a work that creates controversy, on purpose or not. What are the challenges and possibilities of the ways of acting for the curators in that situation? What are the role of the institutions? And what are the role of the publics? And I say that in plural because we're not dealing with one public, but probably different publics that have various ways of reacting to the material. Now, those of you who looked at the VLE will know that I will use two case studies. One is an exhibition called The Beast and the Sovereign. That was at the Reina Sofia Museum, at the MACBA Museum in Barcelona in 2014. And then I will talk about a little bit about the Whitney Biennial from last year, but particularly one work that I was really debating whether to show or not. So let's see if I'm going to do that. But I have to say immediately that this talk is going to contain material that might be unpleasant. Some of it is unpleasant for me in terms of violence, death, and racism. The opening credits, the tune that ran through the opening credits was a protest song from 1963 called The Death of Emmett Till, written and performed by Bob Dylan at the height of the unity of the civil rights movement in the United States. And it's interesting, I think, in terms of what we'll be looking at in a little while, that at the time the song was discarded, it was not released. Maybe the author didn't think it was good enough. It's certainly not the strongest protest song of the time. But it refers to a very specific case, which is the murder of an African-American boy, 14 years old, in 1955, called Emmett Till. Also the topic of a now very infamous painting. So what's at stake in this photograph? This is taken from Auschwitz in 1944. It's one of the 4 surviving photographs from Auschwitz, smuggled out in a can of toothpaste. And it was photographed by the Sonderkommando, which was a very specific task given to some of the inmates, to some of the prisoners, namely to work in the gas chamber itself, to lead their fellow men and women into the gas chambers without telling them what was going to happen, to clean out the gas chambers and to get rid of the bodies. Now, if you, as one of the men given this task, I think there was about 4 or 5 of them, revealed the situation, you would be thrown into the flames where they burned the bodies and be burned alive. This was a punishment. So we can probably not imagine the horror of the situation, the horror of working there. Why did these men decide to take photographs? It was extremely complicated. They had to do it clandestinely. And they had one guard on the roof and one person inside the room, the furnace room, that managed to take these 4 photographs that are now the only 4 surviving photographs of the atrocities. And they had them sent to the Polish resistance in Warsaw towards the end of 1944 with the following message. It was the accompanying note. Urgent, send 2 metal rolls of film for 6x9 as fast as possible. have possibility of taking photos. Sending you photos of Birkenau showing prisoners sent to gas chambers. One photo shows one of the stakes at which bodies were burned. This is what we see here. When the crematorium could not manage to burn all the bodies. The bodies in the foreground are waiting to be thrown into the fire. Another picture shows one of the places in the forest where people undress before showering, as they were told. And then go to the gas chambers. Send film roll as fast as you can. Send the enclosed photos to tell. We think enlargements of the photos can be sent further. What is meant by sent further? Further where? Right, so these are the questions that a very interesting art historian, but also historian of images, Georges Didi Uberman, has pondered in a very interesting book called Images in Spite of All, 4 photographs from Auschwitz. Now in this book he makes the argument that these images of the unimaginable requires our attention. We have an obligation to see them, to witness, and to imagine the unimaginable. He starts his book with the following gambit. In order to know, we must imagine for ourselves. We must attempt to imagine the hell that Auschwitz was in the summer of 1944. Let us not invoke the unimaginable. Let us not shelter ourselves by saying that we should not by any means imagine it to the very end. We are obliged to that oppressive imaginable. It is a response that we must offer as a depth to the words and images that certain prisoners snatched for us from the harrowing reel of their experience. In return, we must contemplate them, take them on, and try to comprehend them. Images in spite of all, in spite of our inability to look at them as they deserve, in spite of our own world, full, almost choked with imaginary commodities. Now, this book, of course, sparked a huge controversy, because for some commentators, these pictures are unimaginable. Indeed, one of the debates around the photographs have been whether they are real. So some researchers refuse to accept that they are real because it is an atrocity of such enormous proportions that it is unimaginable, that it cannot be seen. I'm sorry for the misspelling. Girard Watchman is his name, is one of the main critics of Didi Uberman's book, because in his view there can be no images of the Shoah. There should be no images. They should not be circulated. We should not commodify horror. We should not imagine it. We should not partake in spreading it. He says that this is it's the social, ethical, and political danger of a faith in images and of an announcement of the image. So for Watchman, the position is that these images should be destroyed, not circulated, never looked at again. Right? So these are quite extreme reactions to the same images, to the same image production. Now, these are, of course, not artistic images, and it's important to say that the role of photography of this kind, even though there has been manipulations attempted through these 4 photographs, are, of course, in terms of them being an index of the real. So, not representational images. So this, I think, is an important background for some of what we're going to discuss, and particularly who has the right to use, to circulate, and discuss certain images, particularly images of pain. This will also come up in the next lecture. So to that, I'll jump to something slightly less ominous, but nonetheless a very interesting case, which is the exhibition called The Beast and the Sovereign, based on the theories of Derrida. Says that there are two in this book by Derrida. The idea is that there are two beings that cannot understand the law, which is the sovereign, because the sovereign is above the law, and the beast, because the beast is not yet subjected to the law. This was curated. This is interesting in discussing the case by two German curators, Hans Christ and Iris Dressler, and then by two Spanish curators who were working as part of the staff at the Magba Museum at the time, Paul Preciado and Valentin Roma. So this is I guess a typical example of a certain type of research-based thematic curating that takes a philosophical figure or trope and tries to illuminate a number of works, disparate works, collected and commissioned according to those tropes, and at the same time try to create, if you will, a kind of illustration of what such terms from a philosopher like Jacques Derrida could mean through the production of contemporary art. So far, so good. This exhibition was also taking place at the MACBA, the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Barcelona, which is a fairly new museum. It's, of course, has been very famous for making exhibitions that created a line between conceptual art, institutional critique, etc. from the 1960s, and then I would say new social movements and identity-based politics and activism of the 90s and 2000s. So at the height of its fame, at the height of its also celebration on the so-called left of the art world. This was seen as the model museum. MACBA has done many exhibitions of this kind, has worked with activists, and of course also had a critical studies program, a queer critical studies program run by then Beatrice Preciado, before Beatrice became Paul. So it was funded by the museum, and then it was funded by the Bundeskulturstiftung, which is the biggest public funder of art in Germany. This is very important again in understanding the case or the controversy, because the exhibition was first shown at MACBA, and then it traveled to Stuttgart, to Germany, to an institution where Hans Christ and Iris Dressler are the directors, Württembergischer Kunstverein in Stuttgart. A huge part of the funding for this project came from the Bundeskulturstiftung. So, one of the works is this one, by the Austrian artist Ines Duszak, called Not Dressed for Conquering. It's a sculpture that depicts apparently a sexual act, although, as Ines has assured me, there is no penetration. And I have looked under the sculpture and there isn't. But nonetheless, it depicts, of course, a man who is very recognizable for Spanish people, Latin American people too, the former king, Juan Carlos I, who was the king of Spain that was put in place by Franco, by the fascist regime in the 1970s. He's now retired. So he is at the bottom here. On top of him we have a beast, and then we have a woman whose name is Domitila Barrios de Chungara, who was a very important Bolivian activist. She was the leader of the Housewives Committee of the Siglo XX mine in Potosi, Bolivia. Potosi, Bolivia is the single largest silver mine strike in history known to mankind, accounting for more than half the global production of silver for over a century, from when the mine was discovered in the mid-19th century. So she was one of the union leaders there. So this is the work. It's a kind of collage, it's caricature perhaps. I'm not going to debate the artistic quality of this work. You can think of it what you want. But 3 days before the opening of the exhibition, the director, the then director of MACBA, Bartomeu Mari, walks through the installation, sees this work, freaks out, and closes the exhibition. Says this exhibition cannot open. Cancels the opening, cancels the press. Simply, if you censors not just the work but the whole exhibition, right? So one of the questions, of course, is why. As it turns out, he did not discuss this with his board, but he did it because he was worried about the reactions of his advisory board. He was worried about the potential insult to the former king, as the protector of the MACBA Museum is Reina Sofia, the wife of Juan Carlos I. So this was presumably the reasoning. So the work from his point of view was considered politically unacceptable, obscene, possibly pornographic. Now, of course, immediately this is in the press, it's in the international art press. Not a single person, hardly anybody officially in the art world supports the director. Everybody talks about this case. There's now a book about it as well, as a frightening example of contemporary censorship of art and conservatism of institutions. So yeah, that's a big fallout. Not only does he close the exhibition, he also fires the curators with 1 day's notice, Paul and Valentine, for insubordinance. So obviously it's a scandal of some magnitude. Now, as I said, the exhibition was of course partly financed by the Bundeskulturstiftung. So he cannot fire the freelance curators, the two German curators in this case. And as they tell him in no uncertain terms, is that all the money that has been invested into this museum, who's at this time not in the best of economic shapes, all the money that has been invested from Germany will be needed to be refunded. So this is obviously a problem because the money has been spent. Okay, the exhibition hasn't opened, but it's been produced, so most of the money has been spent. So a lot of back and forth. Anyway, the exhibition then opens without an opening and a press conference, so it does open to the public 1 day late. And the firing of the curators is upheld by the director. They take the museum to court for unlawful firing. That has been, as I said, Bartomeu Mari is the former director. That court case has now been settled out of court, so I don't know what the settlement was, but presumably some sort of financial compensation. Anyway, of course, Valentin now is the director of another institution in Barcelona, and Paul is a global star, so we do not need to worry about those two too much. But this is obviously, as I mentioned, quite a bit of an issue. MACBA is part of an international conglomerate of museums that consider themselves to be the progressive museums of Europe. The Van Abbe Museum and the Reina Sofia in Spain among them. The directors of these places, one of them the director of the Reina Sofia, who was the former director of MACBA and Bartomeu Mari's former boss, puts pressure on him, etc. So he goes to his board, of course, and says, I have done this obviously to protect my institution. This work is intolerable. They accept that it's intolerable. They basically agree with him, and sort of to be gentlemanly about it, he offers his resignation, which is then, to his surprise, accepted. Now, why was Bartomeu fired? Now, I think he was not fired for censorship. I think he was fired for bad management, and I'll get into why. Because, of course, he shouldn't do this 3 days before the opening. And as the 4 curators made him aware of, 6 months earlier, he had personally signed the loan formula for the work. So legally, he had signed off to show this work. Of course, everybody who has worked in museums know that a director would trust his curators to make these decisions, and when you sign the loan formula, there's very small JPEGs perhaps in there. So he probably signed it along with many others, and of course to his horror he didn't realize he had even signed the loan formula for this piece. So the outcome is that not only is the show open, but of course you could say the show gains certain notoriety. All of a sudden all the art magazines reviewed it, and in many ways both the artist and the curators became freedom fighters for the freedom of speech in countering new liberal consensus and censorship. So that's what one can conclude on the surface about this case. What's interesting, of course, is that it was not the first time this work was shown. So it was shown the year before in the 31st Sao Paulo Biennial in Brazil, curated by Charles Escher. And here the work also drew quite a lot of controversy. So it's not that the curators didn't know that this would be potentially controversial, of course. Now, during the opening, a few weeks after the opening of the 31st Sao Paulo Biennial in 2014, the work was deemed potentially inappropriate for visitors under 18 because of the situation it depicts. So this assessment came in the form of a verbal report given to the foundations, to the biennial team. And this inspection happened after a campaign from a Catholic group who considered parts of the exhibition, not just this work, but many parts of the exhibition blasphemous and morally wrong. And there was a large number of complaints against a number of works. The assessment was oral, so there was no official instructions on how to proceed, but nonetheless the biennial took a decision, more or less with the agreement of the curatorial team, but certainly not with the agreement of the artist, to build a new wall a couple of weeks after the opening of the exhibition. Now this is of course very unusual. It's also technically difficult and risky because you have lots of artworks already installed, so to build basically a new room in the middle of the exhibition that's already open is not the easiest of tasks. But nonetheless this was done, and the wall was there to keep the sculpture out of sight for those who inadvertently walked around the exhibition by creating a separate entrance to this work. And it had outside a sign that specified its, I quote, potentially inappropriate nature. Basically a trigger warning. So there you can say there was a kind of clear institutional censorship that, in this case, was led to a compromise between the curatorial team, the curating, the selection, the representation made possible by the exhibition, and the institution, which did not, did involve the artist, but did not follow the artist's wishes or intentions. The reasons for part of the reasons why Ines wanted to show it at MACBA was because of the partial censoring of the work in Sao Paulo. So these are two different, let's say, instances. One of them creates a indirect boundary between parts of the audience and the work. The first one tried to completely eradicate the exhibition, but ended up with basically eradicating all the individuals in the institution instead. This one had this compromise between, let's say, the audience members that complained and found it immoral, and the institution. So different types of censorship, one that was successful and one that was unsuccessful, you could say. But it goes back even further, why I find this work so interesting. Because the work, as I told you, the woman depicted in the work, Domitila Barrios de Tungara, is from Potosi, which is a very important city in what is now Bolivia, what's very important for the Spanish Empire during colonial times. As I said, when the Spanish found this mine, they couldn't believe their luck, basically, because it was the biggest silver strike ever in history. Now, the work was actually commissioned, or not commissioned, made and suggested for this exhibition called the Potosi Principle, which was curated by two artists, two very famous artists, Alice Kreisler and Andreas Siegmann from Berlin, and a curator, Max Holgehinderer. So I'll just find a quote to. So this exhibition was a very, I would say, discursive exhibition that had, first of all, it was laid out like an essay. So it had a pathway that you were supposed to walk through the exhibition, and a catalog with text for various that related to a numbering system that was installed throughout the exhibition. Now it's interesting, it was made by two curators, I think, by two artists. I think curators would not be able to get away with that in an institution like the Reina Sofia, so connected, of course, to Magba, if you will. Now, the curators, in their statement, says that the images of Potosi are a shimmering reflection of an extremely violent settlement policy, whose primary purpose was the reproduction and monopolization of labor. We make the claim that there are parallels between the ideological function of colonial area painting. Indeed, it's very interesting. So, what we call classical painting in English, in Spanish, in Latin America, it's called colonial painting, actually, in the vernacular. And the modern day function assumed by art, that of legitimizing the elite of globalization. So they took the metaphor and the site of Potosi as the generator for a show around current forms of recolonization and the global distribution of labor. They did so by including, very interestingly, these classical/colonial paintings, masterpieces from the 19th century, 18th, 19th centuries, together with contemporary works of art. So you could say, as an artistic intervention, as much as a curatorial one, it's an example of what we could call the exhibition as medium. The exhibition becomes the medium for an artistic project. Of course, one of the complications being that they involved also contemporary artists in the show that then made suggestions for works they felt could contribute to this particular debate that Alice, Andreas, and Max wanted to have. So one of the works proposed and originally made for this exhibition was the one that I just showed you, Not Dressed for Conquering, by Ines Dushak. But if anybody have seen the show, they might remember that this work was not in the show. Because when the artist suggested this work to the curators, who were even artists, so not employees of the museum, they were not very happy. And they went to the director, who was one of the people who criticized Bartomeu Mari just a few years later. And he was also not very happy about this work. They felt it was too controversial, that it was too crass, that it was too sensationalist, and that its potential defamation of the former Spanish king, plus its potential pornographic elements in a Catholic country would shadow for the debate on colonization and recolonization that they wanted to have. So they rejected the work and said, could you please make us another one? Which Ines duly did. At the same time, wanting very much to show this on some other occasion. So this, of course, happens all the time. And in this case, there was no press debate, no public having the possibility of reacting one way or another, no art world support, because it was not censorship. It's called curating. Right? So this brings us to the unpleasant part. So I'm going to show an image that I really don't want to show you. So if anybody doesn't want to see it, now's the time to leave. Because it's a very violent image. I've taken the one that is less violent. So this is the death of Emmett Till. This is his dead body. As you can see, drastically disfigured, bloated from having lain in the water. I think when we're talking about these kind of images, this has been declared one of the 100 most important images by Life magazine. This, of course, this image and this case galvanized the civil rights movement in the United States, both among African Americans and whites. Now, it needs to be shown in terms of what Jean-Luc Godard says, the political struggle between one image and another, together with this image, which is the acquittal of the two men that murdered Emmett Till. They are leaving the court case. They were acquitted of his murder by an all-white jury, of course, in 1955. Now, for those who do not know the case, I didn't look it up before, I'll just briefly explain it. So, Emmett Till was 14 years old, lived in Chicago, had family in the South, went to visit his family with some of his cousins and friends. He went to a shop that the woman you see on your right, Mrs. Bryant, owned. She was 21 years old. There was an encounter between the two. Nobody knows exactly what happened. Now, Emmett Till's cousin said that he had, as a dare, tried to ask her for a date. He had shown his friends pictures of his classroom in Chicago that was not segregated and claimed to have a white girlfriend. He went in there. She claims that he was inappropriate, that he whistled at her, that he touched her, basically sexual harassment, and then was kicked out of the shop. So later, his cousin said that there was no photograph. He don't know what actually happened in there. He know that Emmett Till went into the shop, talked to the woman. She later in her life said that the story that he had flirted with her, used inappropriate words, touched her thighs, were total fabrication. So we don't know what conversations took place between them. We'll never know. Certainly something happened that created some sort of relation of desire that was unacceptable. So she tells her husband, who is standing next to her smoking, that this horrible incident had happened. Her husband, Roy Bryant, and his friend J.W. Millam decides to abduct Emmett Till 2 days later. They torture him, shoot him, and dump him in the Tallahassee River. The body is washed up a few days later. They get indicted, and it's an all-white jury that acquits them of the crime. A few weeks later, they triumphantly tell the press that of course they did it because the boy was out of order. So that's the case, right? So think about these two images, the relationship between them. These are again press images. And think about who is speaking through them. Now, one of the things that was very famous with this image, I won't let you stare at it too long, don't worry. But I don't know, I find it equally horrible, so look at the other one. Emmett Till's mother, said that she wanted him buried in an open casket for all the world to see what they have done to my boy. Brings us to this image. At the Whitney Biennial, 2 years ago, you probably all know the controversy. Now, this is a painting that takes a historical event and a historical event and figure and transforms it into an aesthetic image, right, that nonetheless relates to a specific historical moment. Now, this led to just find my notes here. Led, of course, to huge protests. Started by our very own Hannah Black, who was a graduate from this college, this department, as a Facebook post. So I think it's also important to remember, as Aruna de Souza, she makes certain claims on behalf of this petition, on behalf of this statement from Hannah Black, and also some excuses, and one of them is to say, you have to understand it's written in the form of the Facebook post. Which I think obviously it is. So for those, you probably all saw it many times, but I'll read it for you anyway. To the curators and staff of the Whitney Biennial, I'm writing to ask you to remove Dana Schutz's painting Open Casket, and with the urgent recommendation that the painting be destroyed and not enter into any market or museum. Now this is the line that, of course, created another controversy. There was a controversy around the work, whether Dana Schutz has the right to paint this motif, whether the museum should show it, or whether the museum should remove it. So that's one huge controversy. The other one is, does Hannah Black has the right to ask for the destruction of the work? Right? Of course, for a lot of commentators, the idea of burning paintings, burning books has a certain historical reference that also relates to something I showed you earlier in this lecture. So, Hannah Black goes on, as you know, this painting depicts the dead body of 14-year-old Emmett Till in the open casket that his mother chose. Let the people see what I have seen. This is not the quote that was circulated at the time. That was the one that I gave you. But again, that quote comes from one of Emmett Till's cousins. So we don't know if Mamie Till really said to show the world what they have done to my boy. We don't know if that was her exact words. That even the disfigured corpse of a child was not sufficient to move the white gaze from its habitual cold calculation is evident daily and in a myriad of ways, not least the fact that this painting exists at all. In brief, the painting should not be acceptable to anyone who cares or pretends to care about black people, because it is not acceptable for a white person to transmute black suffering into profit and fun, though this practice has been normalized for a long time. So this is the first accusation against the artist. You do not have the right as a white person, to transmute black suffering into profit and fun. So that's Hannah Black's interpretation of the image. Although Schutz's intention may be to present white shame, this shame is not correctly represented as a painting of a dead black boy by a white artist. Those non-black artists who sincerely wish to highlight the shameful nature of white violence should first of all stop treating black pain as raw material. Again, I think the notion of raw material is, of course, directly relates to the history of slavery and the colonial exploitation. Right? The subject matter is not Schutz's. This is again one of the famous lines from this. White free speech and white creative freedom have been founded on the constraints of others and are not natural rights. The painting must go. It goes on and then ends again with this claim that that the painting has to be removed and that Schutz does not have the right to this material as a white person, and it's a kind of commodification of the violence against black people. So this, of course, is heavily attacked, mainly by also a person of color, Coco Fusco, who wrote a text in response called Censorship, Not the Painting Must Go. Right, and says that the criticism is misguided, even if Fusco sort of, I wouldn't say she distanced herself from the painting, but she doesn't defend the painting, but she defends the artist's right to make such a painting, and particularly says that Hannah Black misunderstands the meaning of the original image. Because in Hannah Black's statement, the open casket was chosen to caution blacks against the violence that white people not only could but would inflict upon them. Coco Fusco, by using the original quote, says that no, it was for all the world to see, white and black. This was the point. This is why it was important in the civil rights movement. This was the reason to circulate the image of the dead body. So this is the one. This is the one of a three-pronged attack that Fusco uses against Hannah Black. This is the first one, that she misunderstands the original meaning of the image. I think, even though we can of course discuss what the meaning of that image would be, and furthermore that she does not consider the history of anti-racist art by white artists. As she says, she does not recognize the trope of the suffering body that originated in Western art with the figure of the Christian martyr, informs much representation of racialized oppression by white as well as black artists. He goes on to then mention the work of Carol Walker. So those are the two lines of criticism that leads her then to say the problem is censorship. Artists should not censor other artists. Then we play into the hands of the conservative right. Of course, Coco Fusco herself had been on the front lines in the 1990s fighting against censorship from mainly right-wing groups and politicians in the United States against contemporary art. Some may remember the famous case of Robert Mapplethorpe. And of course, she claims that the idea that the painting should not only not be shown, but it should be destroyed, brings up memories of violent types of censorship, and that no artist should have the right to claim the destruction of another artist's work. Now, one, of course, issue here is, would this image be different if Dana Schutz was a person of color? That's impossible to say. We can't say that. Here the context completely overshadows the text. It's impossible to say. My argument is that it would be. And I would say, if we look at the work, of course, the continuous work, there's also another one which shows Michael Jackson's body on the autopsy table that Dana Schutz, for some reason, found it necessary to paint. This is the work that made her famous, called Presentation, from 2005. I have the very interesting wall text. This was when she was very young. She was a graduate of the Columbia Art School, at the time very famous, and was created a big rupture in the New York art world, because the Museum of Modern Art didn't often buy works of very young artists, and they bought this one from 2005. see if I can find the wall text. It's very interesting because when we think of so this is the wall text at the Museum of Modern Art. Although the paintings themselves are not specifically narrative, American artist Dana Schutz explains, I often invent imaginative systems and situations to generate information. End of quote. This painting depicts just such a contrived situation in which a mutilated and partially dismembered figure lies on a board suspended above an opening in the ground. Whether the figure is about to be lowered into the grave or has been recently exhumed, we do not know. Solemn onlookers in a seemingly endless procession gather and file past. Boldly executed, amazing that they use the word executed, in high-keyed colors, the composition is evocative of art historical precedent, yet evades any specific narrative or interpretation. I think if you show this in an American museum, it's very difficult not to think of the violence against the Native Americans, to me, but certainly the spectacle of violence, if not the aesthetification of violence, is a trope in the work, right? Way before the painting of Emmett Till. So I found it quite interesting, of course, the way that I think Coco Fusco uses a type of critical theory that does not speak to the contemporary moment, that does not speak to the context in which the work was shown. I don't particularly want to destroy the work myself either, but then I probably belong to the same generation as Coco Fusco, so my references would be similar. And there is, as Aruna de Souza also explains, a very clear generational divide in the way that artists reacted to the painting. So in her book Whitewalling, which is takes 3 case studies of what she calls whitewalling in the United States, starts out with Dana Schutz's work at the Whitney Biennial, and then goes back in history to show not just a repetitive history but a recursive one. And of course, again, I think the context of the Whitney Biennial at that very moment is extremely important in understanding the controversy, because the previous edition, I mean, the Whitney Museum for many years was known, particularly among African American artists, as the Whitey, because of their lack of representation of persons of color. But they also, in order to diversify, they had decided that the Whitney Biennial couldn't just show artists from New York City. So they felt that to diversify was to show artists from all over the country. And they did so in the edition preceding this one, so the 2014 edition, which had 109 artists in it, and I think 4 persons of color. So of course it was heavily criticized for that. So ironically, this version was supposed to be the one that made amends, was supposed to be the revisionist one that updated the format of the Whitney Biennial and was more inclusive in terms of color. So one of the main, of course, curatorial traits or tropes in the show was to show works that in one way or another related to the Black Lives Matter movement. One of the few things that the curator said about it was that, which I think we probably need to take to task a little bit, is Mia Locks, who is an independent curator. It should be said that the 2 curators were both persons of color, both Asian American. She said that she wanted to highlight the act of curating as something that can generate uncertainty. This is important, it has merit. So the goal of curating here is to put works together in order for them to generate conversation. Uncertainty, ambiguity, open-endedness, even dissension is itself a curatorial value. the question that the D'Souza then asked is, what are the limits of this curatorial value? So, this kind of work, of course, has historical precedents. I think it's interesting that one of the earlier critics of Dana Schutz was actually Helen Molesworth, who in a very famous essay on how to install art as a feminist writes about Dana Schutz. She writes about the particular painting, this one, and how she didn't like the work until she started to see it in terms of a feminist genealogy, so a kind of art historical reading where the worth and the relationality of an artwork is always to that of another artist and another artwork, rather than to its, let's say, contemporary political, visual culture, popular culture resonance. And of course, the open casket cannot be read in an art historical terms, not only because of the contemporary moment in which it was shown, but also because the historical image it refers to is an image from reportage, not from art. But one of the things which I find it's interesting, if we want to follow the art historical line, so for Molesworth, mainly artists like Amy Silman, but also Dana Schutz, kind of reconfigure the work of an abstract expressionist like Willem de Kooning, who's of course known for being maybe one of the most misogynist artists ever, where the act of painting is a disfiguring of the female body. These are his famous, from one of his famous series of women from the 1940s. And it's very interesting that when someone like Coco Fusco says that to claim that the work should be destroyed is completely unacceptable in terms of how artists relate to each other, because of course it has an art historical precedent, which is this one, which is a very interesting piece from Robert Rauschenberg, who of course he does it in a kind of act of patricide, the act of erasing a drawing of de Kooning in the early 1950s, when Rauschenberg himself, as a young rising art star, is the way that Dana Schutz would later be, but of course also in the context of abstract expressionism being the dominant form, very masculine, heavily tied with white male heterosexuality, and as a gay man he wanted to do this erasure of the father figures of the artist. Now, amazingly, he convinced de Kooning to give him a drawing. So that maybe says something about a dialogue at that time that we probably can't have today, that he then erased. So there were of course other responses to the work. So one of them was this intervention by Parker Bright. Other people did it too, which was very interesting because it's a kind of artistic intervention that relates to what your choices are as the receivers of artworks, which was to block the view and with this t-shirt, so to stand as a present living black body in front of the painting every day during the opening hours, blocking the view. And most of the pictures we now see circulating is of course this one, because it became very difficult to photograph the image, the painting itself, without this figure in front. So what happened in this case? Well, there was of course a reaction from the artist and from the institution as well, which is quite different from what we just went through with Ines Dushak, because in this case the curators stood by their curatorial choice. They said they did not want to remove the painting. They had of course not intended the hurt that it caused, but they did not intend to remove it. And instead they made a plea for uncertainty. that it's uncertain what the meanings of the works are, their relations, and that uncertainty is productive and generative of meaning, conversation, and politics. And the institution and the curators, of course, knew what kind of work Schutz was doing, deliberately chose this painting, and it had been shown in a private gallery in Berlin the year before without incident, by the way. So it was very conscious that this particular work was shown. And of course it did have the effect that the visitor numbers were the highest they've ever had for Whitney Biennial, because everybody wanted to see this work. And of course it led to the biggest online traffic to their site, as I think de Souza also writes about. A huge part of the conversation, which is very hard to, let's say, anthologize, summarize, of course, happened on Twitter and Facebook. But you could say that this is a case of curating gone viral with this image. So you could say for the institution it was very successful. Of course, what it did, other limits that, of course, it met were, I would say, the limits of representationability, but also the limits of how a contemporary museum can be inclusive and how it can represent difference. I think that due to some of the historical roles that a museum like the Whitney has, it's very difficult for it to not be the whitey. And that goes for a lot of museums, of course. In other words, the antagonism that was produced because of a work like this one shows, I think, the impossibility for an exhibition or an institution to contain difference. Which doesn't mean that they, of course, have to keep representing the same universal white male subject as the ideal viewing subject for perpetuity, but that I think in the buildings of institutions themselves, they have to recognize that they cannot represent everyone. And not everybody feels represented by museums. So I was going to do a second part, which was about how one could think more methodologically of these issues of representation and not work with representation itself, but I think that would have to be a separate talk. I would just want to end with, if I can get out of this. So I think I showed you this as the opening credits, this protest song from the height of the unity of the civil rights movement, but I want to end with something that I think speaks more to the complexity of the contemporary moment. It's something that you all know, but I'll show it anyway.
I normally have a question. I don't actually know what I need to ask you at this point, because I think there's the structure of the presentation itself. Because you have quite three very different, not just different kinds of image, different registers of image, but the operation of the images is very different in each case. So you could draw some analogy, I guess, between the first image you showed, the images from Auschwitz, and maybe the initial reportage of Emmett Till, because they're both sort of referential images from the real, undoctored photographs and so on and so forth. And both sets of images belong to a time of you would assume the image to be not manipulated from the beginning, which is different to now. So there's that connection, and then on the other hand, there's a connection between the work by Ines Dushak that you showed, and the Dana Schutz image, because they're both art images operating as art images in art institutions produced in very standardized sort of art formats. But I can't quite sort of go across all three simultaneously. And the other thing would be, for me, that the Dana Schutz work is, of course, in the context, and Hannah Black's response and the concept of protest is in the context of Black Lives Matter, where you have a huge profusion of images of black men, especially, and children being killed. and that profusion is to do with social media itself. So there's something about the way that maybe there's something to be drawn between the secrecy and particularity of those images from Auschwitz and how they were taken with the letter and the one-to-one relationship of the correspondence, or the smuggled out letter going to a particular reader, against the kind of mass distribution of, the Facebook posting of images of black slaughter, essentially, in the United States, and the way that the controversy played out through the museum. So there are kind of parallels and discrepancies between all the examples. But I think for me, I'm kind of struggling to fit the Ines Dushak piece and the controversy around that with the other two, because I see those much more in the as you said in the talk, those other images speak directly to the currency of the situation in which those images take place, whereas the Ines Dushak piece and the controversy around it seem to be very much about a king who's already not the king anymore, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to do with almost like a sacred notion. I guess I didn't understand why that piece was controversial at all. I mean, you see it, you're like, well, okay. So there seemed to be something in it to do with the figure of the king, particularly, and what the king means in Spain, and maybe also to do with like being installed by a fascist regime in the first place, which sort of seemed to be in the center of the controversy. But again, that feels like quite a dated context. The Potosi moment seems not in the same image regime as the others. So I was wondering if you could just kind of track the structure of the talk and what you're trying to do with the three examples.
Well, I think it's the placement, distribution, and the presentation of the images that I find interesting. To think around the limits of that and the problems of that, because that's what it means to show something in a public museum.
Okay,
is to grapple with those questions. So, in terms of the Dushak work, it may be surprising why it's controversial, but I think that's probably just to us, because in Brazil the problem wouldn't be the former Spanish king.
No.
So there it's the amoral sex that it apparently shows, which it doesn't show, but which you might think it shows. So that would be so this is a notion of a public outcry towards an institution from part of its public saying this is unacceptable. So in terms of how a museum reacts to that, there is no difference in their governing structure between that episode and then the episode of Dana Schutz.
Okay.
So the reaction might be different if they were to say, which of course the curators would say in the case of the Sao Paulo Biennial, well, we don't care that these Catholic groups don't like it, that's why we want to show it. Right, so it's very different because of course the Dana Schutz's defense, which of course got heavily criticized, was one of empathy, that she also as a parent has empathy for the situation. Of course one would say, why does she have empathy with an event that's historicized from 1955 and not with current violence? This is one of the oddities, I think, of that defense, and I think it's a rationalization actually of what is an aesthetic. What I think the work is about is aesthetic pleasure. And I think that's part of why it's offensive. That's why it's offensive to me, not the color of Dana Schutz. And the other thing that she said, which is also just this argument that happens in one register that is so far from, let's say, Black Lives Matter, which is to say, okay, I understand that maybe this could be turned into profit, so I'm not going to do that. So I'm not going to sell this painting ever. I'm not going to burn it, I'm going to destroy it, I'm not going to not show it, I'm not going to sell it. Which is a very strange way of saying that it can come out of circulation. But of course, it's interesting that you can erase drawing and make another artwork. That's not controversial in the same way as it somehow is, or is there a connection between the fact that this is not just some random drawing, it's an actual painting that represents a huge potential worth that an artist suggests destroying. That means that the art that what Hannah Black is suggesting is not just censorship, but a destruction of the system of revenue production in contemporary art. Yeah. Which I think that some people react to that subliminally. I think that Coco Fusco reacts to that subliminally.
Okay, can I see if there are any questions? There's one there, and yeah, this one here. Let me ask one while the mic makes its way up there. I guess I hadn't sort of registered during the talk, but it seems to me that when you mentioned the reaction in Brazil to the Potosi work, to work with the king and the strike leader and so on, given what's happened in Brazil in the last month, there's a kind of interesting sort of background of fascism around all three pieces in a sense, because the first one is very obvious. It's the end game of fascism in Germany in the 40s. The second one is in Brazil, the fascists are currently in the lead, and in a way, what gets played out in the Sao Paulo Biennial is a kind of early indication of their political power. Even in Sao Paulo, even with the Biennial, they can still have influence there. So it's like a canary in a coal mine moment. And with the Dana Schutz moment, because of the context of Black Lives Matter, which was that was in the Obama period, but it kind of what we now see is that in a way, the kind of urgency of the politics around that work, it's not just Black Lives Matter, but the response to the attempt to undo Black Lives Matter, which was All Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter. So it's a kind of universalization. That's not Black Lives Matter, which is a particular community who are being systemically damaged by law enforcement. That's what you'd call them. But actually, all lives matter. So we can't select one group of people as being especially victims of a particular power structure. And then Blue Lives Matter becomes actually the cops who are the victims of the whole situation. And that feeds into the kind of frightening things that we now see as sort of prominent in the American political space. So I was wondering if there's something for you around the strategies of exposure, or strategies isn't quite the right term, sort of mechanisms and methods of exposure and placement and distribution, which you mentioned a moment ago, in relationship to this kind of sort of frightening political moment. I don't know if you want to take that, or just take it as a comment.
No, I can. I mean, well, maybe just with Sao Paulo, there's an interesting, but this is kind of anecdotal, but there was, of course, a lot of discussion. So it's funded, of course, by local oligarchs. So they put a lot of pressure on they were very unhappy with the whole biennial at the time, because it worked. This was just one of the works that were controversial. Like I mentioned, we could have gone through many others that weren't censored, but that worked with various indigenous groups, gave them space in the biennial for the first time. A lot of queer work, and they were not very happy. And at one point, one of the board members said to the curators, they had a discussion, said, "This is not Brazil." And I thought that's very interesting, because their response was, "No, it is Brazil. These people are all Brazilian." And then he got very agitated, animated. It's not my Brazil. And I think that's kind of the key. I wish they would put that in some of the text they wrote around it, because that's kind of the key in terms of who are the people that you think these institutions should speak for and speak to. Who are they representing?
James.
Yeah, just visiting that point about the connection between the Duchamp work and the Schultz work. I wonder whether it might illustrate the shift from a more old-fashioned notion of censorship to the incoming versions of censorship, the former seeming quite anachronistic to us here in this room, as I think you've already said. It was revealing that you said that nobody spoke up in defense of that censorship. It was pretty much universal that people spoke in favor of the artwork, and it's a very comfortable thing to support freedom of speech in that case, because the target is institutional authority, and we're conditioned to feeling comfortable with free speech on that ground, whereas the thorny question of the authority of victimhood, which can be claimed to shut down other forms of image production, makes the Dana Schultz case much more uncomfortable for us, much more complicated. So I thought, for me, really one of the most important points that you raised in the whole talk was the generational shift, and perhaps the discussion that might need to happen about incoming forms of censorship and possibly the unintended consequences that's going to lead to. Because once image production is subject to censorship on the grounds that it's trumped by a socio-political agenda, so that historical marginalization can be used as a grounds for stopping people producing images, then that argument can be used for other forms of socio-political agendas that aren't progressive. So that was just an observation about the relationship between the Duchamp work, this, I think, really clumsy form of censorship, and the much more subtle challenge that we're being faced with on the issue of censorship and free speech. I'm not sure how to form that as a question, but it was certainly an observation that came up.
I think it has a lot to do with the position of the speaking subject in a hierarchy of speaking positions in terms of institutions. So now in de Souza's book, she says that this has nothing to do with censorship, it's the wrong term. It is a critique from those that are marginalized against how institutions' ideas, Hannah Black writes about it too, I would say, or maybe a little bit clumsily, but it is a Facebook post, that this idea of free speech, that I can speak about whatever I want anytime I ever want as an artist, is white privilege. That's the definition of white privilege. So if that's your analysis, then it's not about censorship. Then it's about undoing the privilege of whiteness. And for Coco Fusco, the way that that's done is through censorship. So that's the generational shift, right? That is an act of censorship. But you will see in de Souza's thinking, and I think for most of the activists, that has nothing to do with censorship. You could call it institutional critique, actually, but of course it's directed towards an artist as much as an institution, is one aspect. The other one that de Souza mentions, where I think one thing I would say about both de Souza and Fusco that annoys me a little bit, is that they both try to make their opponent more stupid than they are, which I think is really a shame. That they try to reduce the arguments of their opponents. I think that's exactly what we don't need. I think that's why I tried to show a very complex, very entertaining but extremely uncomfortable video. The first time I saw it, I didn't know what to make of it.
The Childish
Gambino. I don't think anybody did. But it really speaks to this moment in a way that, that folk song, this horrible crime was done by these horrible people. If we stop doing these crimes, we'll be a better country. In defense of the author of that song, Bob Dylan, he did discard it. He didn't publish it at the time. He didn't think it was very strong work. But nonetheless, you see the huge difference in the way that, in this case, popular culture producers work with the situation. But one thing that Sousa also says, she says it was always about value and about access and circulation. And the argument is that Dana Schutz work talks about Black Lives Matter at a moment when those involved in it should have the right to speak. So she takes up the institutional place of someone else, which I think is very interesting, because of course every act of representation that you do in a curatorial project involves an act of depresentation as well. Because whenever you select and present something, you choose not to present something else, which is then not part of that worldview, that stage that you create with your binding. And that's the political, aesthetic and ethic task that you then have as a curator in an institution when you select and deselect. But of course the same goes for, and that's why I wanted to show and I didn't show the most graphic one of Emmett Till. I think I think that the idea of that image was really that it should have circulated the way things would circulate on Facebook now. The same even with the images from Auschwitz. Send them further for further circulation. But to appropriate images, when we appropriate images, I think you really have to think about what are your stake in those images and which are the ways in which you appropriate them. And I think that I don't think that Danish Schutz has done that work artistically.
I guess the issue would be that censorship is too crude a term for what's going on here, because there's the censorship argument. I mean, we see this a lot now being brought up by the right. That censorship is the thing to beat anybody who's making specific power claims and dealing with the stratification of historical power and power distribution in the present. So if you say, well, we need to contend with this, and so we need to protect ourselves from damage from the outside, it immediately becomes a claim of censorship, and in a way it's the kind of liberal trap. But censorship just is something that needs to be avoided at all costs. In a way, misrepresents the concrete issue that's going on, which maybe is taking place, I think, in fairly clumsy ways, as you said, through the controversy around the Danish Schutz painting. Like something else is going on in that, which is actually incredibly important, that you were alluding to at the end, that there are structural constraints on the Whitney, which makes it the Whitey. There are maybe structural constraints on the Tate, which leads to the kinds of representations that are in the current Turner Prize and so on. There's a question over here. Sorry, let me give you the mic.
I was thinking a lot about the work of Renzo Martin in Joy Poverty, and thinking about, you mentioned revenue production, and revenue production taking it to the place of this. So like, for example, we're getting a lecture around the pain of others, and those others are not being able to take revenue on this lecture. So, it's a very delicate conversation, that we are all partaking in. And when we introduce the pain of others, and the person that is introducing and representing and bringing that pain of others to a group is not that other, what happens? There's a revenue that is being kind of taken. If we look at Renzo Martin's work, what he did was in Enjoy Poverty. He's a Belgian white male artist who went to Congo, and in very simple terms to describe the piece, what he did was he was teaching Congolese people as to how to represent the poverty, but capitalize on that representation. So let's say not the Guardian, the top white male, possibly white male Guardian photographer going to Congo to capitalize and take revenue on their misery. And he's, it's a very kind of controversial piece, but I think that can be articulated to everything, when we touch upon the other. And that's a very tricky place and a very delicate place. And I'm wondering, what can we do around that? It's a very, because, art always is, not always, but many times talking about the other. So, and there's revenues involved, and it's the ethics there. It's delicate, if we start talking around these issues. So it's not a question, it's just opening something around these things.
Let me quickly add to that. Just a small, but it strikes me that what Danish Schutz's work is about the spectacle of the black body being on public view. I mean, that's what the previous image of hers that you showed was about. It's not somber funeral goers, it's gawping members of the public taking great pleasure in the dissection of a black male celebrity. Okay, so her work's already about that, but I think not with enough nuance, or perhaps that old phrase, political commitment, or action outside the gallery. It seems like these are becoming kind of flashpoints for a much bigger problem or crisis in which you have institutions like the Whitney propped up by corporate money, and in the process of gentrification, I mean, the stuff that we know very much about, presenting images about, work about, without doing anything to change the conditions that have led to the injustices in the first place.
But artists too, right? It's not just institutions.
It's not just, no, but they are, but the artists are part of the institution. I mean, they are institutionalized.
I just wanted to wrap it up, like, it's noticed because there's something around the ethics of talking about the other. So, like, what are the ethics involved in what I think is the white male body discussing the pain of others and taking revenue around that pain on this subject? It's a tricky question, but it's happening because this is what we're discussing. Where do these ethics start and end in regards to these questions? And it's a question I ask myself in some of the subjects that I work with.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to be outed as white. That's great. So it gives me more privilege. But I think, well, that part of the discussion is, of course, complicated, and it should be, and it is painful, and it should be painful. But I will just say this: that identity for some people is not something you just choose. It's not fluid for everyone because other people put identities on you, as you just did with me. And that's a very tricky thing to deal with. And I think that actually Parker Bright's performance is about that too. So about Renzo Martins, I think it's a very interesting actually example, because Renzo would say the only relationship I can have to Congo is exploitative and how should I put it? Well, colonialist. So I'm embracing that in order for them to make revenue that is honest, right? So there's a kind of there's on one hand a kind of postmodern irony in it, but there's also what you can call cynical reason in it, right? By saying we know this is I think he even says it in one of his films. There's a very interesting. This is the one he did in Chechnya, episode 1, where one of the victims says, yeah, we're really tired of all these war photographers. They don't help us. And he says to the guy, "I'm not here to help you either." So there's that element to his work, right? That he would say that he is engaged in a different form of institutional critique that accepts revenue as the basis of all artistic work. That's probably how he would put it. Again, you could take issue, and I certainly hope you will take issue with that position as with some of the others we've seen today. But it's to say that's a very different position from the ones that we saw, because I think that you could also ask, I think, which nobody has asked Ines, what is her stake in the struggle around land rights for the indigenous in the Andes as an Austrian white woman? I'm outing her as Austrian white. I don't think she minds. So that you can also ask that, right? But I don't think that those questions can be answered in one way or another. But I don't think that solves anything, though.
There's one more up there. I'm going to invite Generation Zero down.
I guess it's this kind of conversation again going back to this kind of idea of these ethics, whereas contemporary art kind of sits in this way where it likes to be very empathetic towards these issues, and artists, we like to solve things, or at least hope that we solve things with our art practice, whether it be our art practice or our curatorial exhibitions. There's this want to actually talk about socio-political issues. But then the other issue is the fact that the art world in its entirety is actually a very privileged place. It's not accessible, really. It's very much made up of wealthier white people. And so then the issue comes is that, do you use your privileges to actually try to help these issues, Or rather, is it more so a conversation about, are you taking the space of somebody? And I think that like Hannah Black's commentary comes from a place of very sincere frustration, because there are so few people who are disadvantaged within the art world. And so when you have people who are not at disadvantage co-opting the pain or taking that, because the art world right now very much is fascinated with pain. It is. It's very much fascinated with pain. And when you have people who don't experience these pains, or maybe not the same pains, and they're making work about that, and they're erasing people who don't even have the right to really exist in these circles, that's kind of the issue there. It's like there's two conflicting things. We say, we care about you, we're sorry, everything's wrong, how can we use our art to help you? At the same time, the kind of entire structure exists in a way that doesn't allow people who have experienced adversity to really infiltrate it.
I don't have a response to it. I agree.
I have two questions for the audience. Anybody from the curating program want to ask a question? Or is it because the boss is here, you're just like, not going to do it? I don't think Simon's going to downmark you if you ask an annoying question. Be all right.
I don't know,
Oh,
maybe.
there's one. Okay. So while the mic goes over there, I'm also going to, in anticipation of the second question, I'm kind of quite keen to have the generational throwdown that Simon alluded to. I do think there's a kind of something happening with like I'm generalizing, but say the students, say as a majority of students during your late 20s, something like that as an average-ish, it seems to me that the politics that's happening at that age is very different to the politics that we as your teachers grew up with and kind of were informed by. And something is not being articulated in that because it tends to become accusative on either side. And I think it's quite important that we discuss it. So I'd quite like to do that at this point, but not for too long, because we don't have that much time.
Can you say a bit more about what you think it is? Because that's a bit vague.
That is quite vague, but I'm hoping just we'll have it out, rather than try and frame it, because I'm not quite sure I understand it. Because
what do you think your generation stands for?
oh, we're just tired post-structuralists, and it's over, and things have moved on. But it's and also because people like us are still running the courses, blah blah blah, publishing. That tends to be the formation of the discourse, and the discourse that gets taught. And there's an attempt to kind of frame whatever is happening around us in those terms, right? And somewhere students are obliged somewhat to do that because they want to sort of go through the mechanisms. But I think something else is happening, which I certainly don't feel I have a handle on. And speaking to people of my generation, we don't have a handle on it at all, and we're quite scared. And also, I have to say that a lot of what seems to be happening in the young generation seems to me to be quite reactionary, like on both sides, on all sides. This isn't like find people on both sides kind of stuff, but it seems to me that there is an issue about the defenses that are put in place around the kind of political claims that are being made, which veer towards what I would consider to be reactionary positions. I'm interested how they're not. So I think that's something that we need to discuss, which might come up through the series. But sorry, I kind of like, on invitation, I rambled on. What was supposed to be this whole question, but you had one, and then Liz has one.
I guess it seems to me like there's so much art that we could look at and say is problematic. So Dana Schutz doesn't seem to me the problem in that sense. It seems more because the curator is really speaking and the institution should be held accountable. I guess the conversation is about accountability because, who cares if Dana Schutz's piece isn't circulated? It practically doesn't exist. And also in relation to that, it seems to me also that the structures of museums and culture in general favoritizes like these kinds of situations occurring. It benefits the Whitney, it benefits any institution to basically create controversy. So in that sense, it seems like a problematic loop that, they find the controversial work, they'll say, oh, this is really good. Someone's going to get upset about this. And therefore, the Whitney stands to benefit regardless of what the kind of socio-political situation is around the general situation. So I don't know what the question is, but it's more.
You're getting a lot more questions.
No, I think that it's very possible. Of course, again, it's pure conjecture that the curators knew this could be controversial. That's very possible. It's also very possible in the case of The Beast and the Sovereign, by the way. There are those who say that they did it deliberately to provoke conflict with the director. Very interesting. I can tell you that story in the pub. It's not going to be. I don't want to have that recorded. But yeah, I think in terms of the curators, there's just one thing I want to add. Of course, is that Mia Locke's one of them. On the one hand, said she favors this, which is a kind of that's like the has been for a long time the party line in terms of curating, because curators support artists. They also support institutions, we know that de facto, but principally they support artists. So they like the open-ended conversation and the uncertain. I think that the political stakes now around aesthetics have changed and heightened in a way that that's no longer a possible answer. So I think that kind of curating, that stance has run out of steam, in my view. Not institutionally, but as an ethical practice, as a possible response, not just to the art world, but to the world. I think it's not. So what that means in terms of curating differently is hopefully what we can discuss, but that could mean, of course, a lot of different things, right? And not just in terms of who you show and who you don't show, but other things too. So that's one thing that I found very weak in the defense of the Whitney curators. The other thing, of course, is the more interesting one and more controversial one. Of course, again, here we get into what I think Suhail finds as the reactionary aspects of the current conversation. So, can the exhibition that's supposed to address Black Lives Matter have, and it has the highest representation of African American artists and other minorities they've ever had, is it okay that the curators are not African American and both Asian American? So she indirectly talks about that and makes the defense for the inclusion of Dana Schutz on those grounds, that she says one of the most important things for her, this is Mia Locke's, is that you do not have to represent your ethnicity. So this is also what Corbina Mercer and others call the burden of representation. This should not lie on you, and it should not only be, Coco Fusco has the same argument, it should not only be the job of African American artists to make work about Black Lives Matter, it should also be the work of white artists like Dana Schutz, and that's what Dana Schutz has done. She says, she doesn't say that last part, I added that, but that's got to be the conclusion, right, in defense of the work. And then at the same time, of course, the kind of strange idea of not acknowledging antagonism, that some antagonisms also in this room, also in a classroom, in an exhibition space, cannot be resolved. Instead, she says, I'm very happy with all these conversations we had. They met with Parker Bright, for example, with Aruna de Souza. They met with all of, I don't know if they met with Hannah Black. I think they might have. Well, they met with a lot of the detractors, and then they said, we had these really positive conversations. It was really interesting. We learned a lot. This is the response. This is how we respond when we get criticized too. I do, not yours. So that's the other part, right? Which is very interesting. I shouldn't make fun of it actually, but it is very interesting.
That kind of leads into the question I had for you. I was thinking a lot as you were speaking about the idea of the autonomy of the artistic image and the artistic sphere, and how censorship in the 20th century sort of rises as an attack on that. It's a way to sort of shut down specific images for the political program, this kind of thing. And how this idea that what artistic images do is provoke discussion is also seems to be a part of that, where it's like any image has to be allowed because
there has to always be more discussion, right? And any image has the potential to provoke another discussion, so it has to be allowed in this sphere. And it seems to me that by the end of the talk, that idea of autonomy was actually what had crumbled, because it became clear that obviously this autonomy is only afforded to certain types of bodies. The type of violence that the Nazis inflicted onto like perverse imagery or Jewish imagery has actually always historically been inflicted on other bodies through history. Repeating myself. And the museum obviously is sort of sacral space where we play art games at a very high level, but that's not that violence. The sort of the violence of the Nazis was not its own special thing in history. It's actually been pervasive and ongoing, right? And I think that's sort of against the figure of the museum as you described it. And I wonder if you think that the museum, if it's unable to sort of take on that challenge of that autonomy sort of crumbling, is there something the museum can now do, or is the museum now an obsolete institution? Or, I mean, because it seems like there's no way back, right? Like,
do you mean just the museum, or are you talking about all?
Well, I mean, so the museum is a figure, but I think like the artistic image as we sort of understand it, because I think that it's changing, and I think that the artistic image will survive, but as a set of sort of almost like weaponized or contingent images, right? As opposed to this broader autonomous space. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm making sense.
Very complicated to answer, I think, in a way that's not extremely long-winded. So, I think for sure that the institutions have problems justifying their mode of address as being universal. I think that's the main problem that they have. They have other problems too, which is, I mean, actually they're, in that sense, they're really in a very strange place now, because on the one hand, we could have that criticism, which could be the more current one around blackness. It could be a more historical post-structuralist one that criticizes this universal subjectivity of the museum. Both of them, right, we can identify, but at the same time, I think that the foundations for them to act as these kind of universalizing, globalizing machines are crumbling. And they're crumbling due to de-Westernization, de-globalization. So, which is, of course, the Brexit, new nationalism, etc.
But can I just add something? But they're also crumbling because William Davis was here last week, 2 weeks ago, and at the end of his talk, he was saying, well, one of the fundamental issue around social media and so on and so forth is basically the liberal spaces, the liberal civic spaces is falling apart from within. It's not just like globalization or de-Westernization, but within the traditional liberal spaces, that this is also eroding from within. So you've got two forces, which is, I think, has been the historical condition of the kind of autonomy or privileges of address. Like you mentioned, universalism is attached to that kind of liberal civic space.
So it's not just Brexit, it threatens that. It's the sort of, thank you.
It's also the critique of Danny Schutz's painting, right? Like it's an attack from both sides, and it seems to be a much more coherent. It seems to be coherent on both sides, and the centre will not hold. Basically, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. But there are certainly advantages to that.
Well, I think, from my position, it seems to be an exciting political moment, not a sort of something falling apart and being terrible.
Okay. You've already had a question. There's one question there, which I think will be the last one. Or statement.
So most of the examples you talked about around issues of who has the right to represent were kind of image-based examples, and I understand that was the kind of focus of the talk anyways. But I think it would be interesting to extend the same set of problematics to different kinds of art that has emerged, not even so recently, but how do we approach the same questions where we're not only thinking about a representation of an identity or historical moment through an image, but the actual artwork is participating and affecting, perhaps helping, and then, then we get closer to the debates that have been going on in activist circles in terms of European people going over to Greece or somewhere to help refugees and so on. But I think trying to bridge the two, I would be very interested to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, that's a whole that's a whole other talk, I think. But some of the same issues I think will come up, which is about antagonism and the not just privilege, but really the position the speaking subject has at the moment in which you enunciate something, whether that's activism or art. So, I mean, there's a lot to be said. Thought about just in terms of image theory, the use of image in activism, the way that the camera is placed, etc., very strategically. What kind of images, what kind of counter images you want to circulate. So that's probably as much as I can say right now.
All right. I get a sense like there's big difficulty in the room that we're not entering, but I think also because we need to enter. If we are to enter it, it's with care. And I'm kind of struck that it's been a really careful discussion, which I think is really very good and very important around these issues. But we can be more careless in the bar. Thanks to. Oh, that was good.
People can attack
those. Or support you and endorse you as well. So let's thank Simon and get to the bar. Thank you.